Okay, so today we're jumping into a really wild idea from our source material. What if the code that runs today's financial markets wasn't born in Silicon Valley, but was actually discovered thousands of years ago on the peaks of ancient mountains? So let's just get right to the big question that frames this whole thing. What on earth could possibly connect ancient mountains to modern Bitcoin? It sounds a little crazy, I know, but just hear me out. Well, the story our source material tells starts way, way back. It takes us to the high peaks of the Iranian plateau and what it describes as a totally forgotten chapter in the history of science. So picture this. Long before we had fancy telescopes and domes, the very first observatories weren't buildings at all. They were mountains, specifically the Zagros and Alborz ranges. The source claims that ancient Iranians weren't just up there looking at the stars. They were using these massive peaks as giant scientific tools to measure the cosmos using pure mathematics, not mythology. And at the heart of all this was a concept called Asha. Now, the source is really clear about this. This wasn't some kind of spiritual belief. It was a scientific framework for understanding how the universe works. And it was all based on precise measurements of geometry and, as our source interprets it today, the principles of thermodynamics. The predictable way energy flows through any system. And this whole way of thinking boiled down to a super practical system of logic. The source actually reinterprets the famous phrase, good thoughts, good words, good deeds, as a scientific process. So, good thoughts? That meant just seeing what was actually there, the observable, universal truth. Good words? Describing that truth with total accuracy. And good deeds? Well, that was about living your life in sync with the universe's predictable mathematical cycles. It was a system built on pure reason. Okay, so if this system was so foundational, so powerful, where'd it go? And this is where the story takes a turn, because the central claim here is that the scientific legacy wasn't just accidentally lost to time, it was actively and systematically erased. You can see how the source lays this out on this timeline. First, you have this aurora, this dawn of mathematical science in ancient Iran. Then, it alleges that this knowledge gets, well, harvested, or as the source puts it, plagiarized by neighboring cultures like ancient Greece. Fast forward to the Enlightenment, and that same knowledge gets repackaged and rebranded as the Age of Reason, a purely Western invention. And the result today? A massive information gap in our understanding of history. And look, it really all comes down to this one powerful quote from the material. The Iranian origin of these calculations was systematically erased. I mean, we're talking about a claim of historical plagiarism on a massive civilizational scale. So, with that original idea, that scientific third way, basically wiped from the history books, the source argues that humanity got stuck. We were left with a false choice, trapped between what it calls two intellectual prisons. And you can see the two extremes right here. On one side, you've got blind belief. This is where people took that pure math about cosmic energy and turned it into personified gods, becoming passive believers. On the flip side, you get cynical skepticism. This is the reaction against all that dogma. But in rejecting the myths, they tossed out the baby with the bathwater. They threw away the original math too, calling it all just superstition. So what happened? Well, according to the source, this created a huge trap. You had this entire culture of active, scientific observers who were suddenly forced to pick a side. Either you passively pray for the future or you become a cynic who believes there's no order to anything at all. That original path, the power to actually observe and predict using math, was just gone. Okay, but here's the kicker. This is not just some dusty old history lesson. The wildest part of this whole argument is that this ancient code is supposedly being reclaimed and proven right now, in the most modern arena you can possibly imagine, the global financial markets. Now, let's be super clear about something the source really hammers home. This is not fortune-telling. It's not astrology, it's not mysticism, it's none of that. Instead, it's applied thermodynamics. Right, applied science. The whole idea is supposedly based on the first law of thermodynamics, that energy can't be created or destroyed, it just changes form. So the thinking goes, that same law applies to our world. Energy flows from the sun and planets, it hits Earth systems, it influences our collective behavior, and that behavior is what moves capital and markets. The math is just tracking that flow of energy. So how is this actually being used? Well, the claim is that this ancient geometric model is being put to work right now for some pretty incredible stuff. We're talking analyzing stock market cycles, tracking the crazy swings of crypto like Bitcoin, even mapping out global energy markets and predicting big social and economic trends. Okay, so to make this a little less abstract, let's take an example from the source. Think about a 180-degree opposition between two planets. Now, in the old myths, that's a battle, right? Good versus evil. But in this system, nope. It's just a measurable geometric angle that represents peak energetic tension. And that tension creates a predictable tug-of-war in human behavior, like a pull between taking risks and playing it safe, which, the source says, you can then see reflected directly in the markets. And so, this is where we land. After walking through this whole radical theory, it leaves us with a really big question, doesn't it? Is it possible that the key to figuring out our future is actually hidden deep in a forgotten mathematical past?